An Apache warrior came begging for milk. She nursed his baby and became the child's second mother. Mary had always lived a peaceful life in the small frontier village. Nestled between the mountains and the dense forest, the village was a quiet place where everyone knew each other, and life followed a steady, familiar rhythm. Mary had moved there as a young woman, escaping the busy life of the city in search of solitude and freedom. She had married a kind-hearted farmer, and together they had built a modest life. But in the harsh landscape of the West, nothing ever seemed to stay calm for long. It was winter, and the cold winds of the mountains had swept into the village, turning the dirt roads into a slick, icy mess. The village's residents had all huddled in their homes, waiting for the snowstorm to pass, their wood fires crackling in the hearths. Mary had always loved the quiet of the season. It gave her time to reflect, to sew new clothes for the coming year, and to take care of her small homestead. Her husband was away that day, tending to their livestock in the nearby pasture. So Mary was alone in her home, preparing dinner. The wind howled outside, and snowflakes swirled in the air, dancing as though they were caught in a feverish dream. The only sound inside was the soft crackling of the fire. She had been busy for hours chopping vegetables for stew, her hands moving automatically as she thought about the days ahead. But her peaceful solitude was soon broken by a knock at the door. At first she thought it was just the wind, but the sound came again, louder this time, more insistent. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone to be out in this kind of weather. Who could it be? Mary set the knife down, wiped her hands on her apron, and made her way to the door, a sense of unease stirring within her. When she opened the door, she was met with a strange sight. A man, his face shadowed by a weathered cloak, stood before her. His eyes were wild with exhaustion, his skin tanned and rough from years of life in the wild. But what caught Mary's attention was not the man's rugged appearance, nor the cold wind biting at his frame. It was the bundle in his arms, a small crying baby wrapped in furs. The baby's cries were weak, barely audible above the howling winds. Mary's heart raced. The man, standing in front of her, appeared just as desperate as the child in his arms. His eyes were filled with pain, a deep sadness that seemed to have taken root in his soul. He staggered slightly, clearly drained from his journey. His breath came in short, heavy gasps, and his hands, though calloused, trembled as he held the baby. He said nothing at first, just looked at Mary with pleading eyes, as if the weight of his words was too much to bear. Mary stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She knew there were tensions between the settlers and the Apache tribe that lived in the region. Her husband had often warned her to stay cautious, never to trust an Apache, especially one who ventured so close to their village. But as she looked at the man, something in her heart softened. She couldn't turn him away, not in this storm, not with a child in his arms. "Please!" the man whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the wind. "Milk for the baby." His words were simple, but they cut through the silence of the night. He wasn't asking for food or shelter, just milk. The baby, weak and fragile, looked at her with wide, trusting eyes, as though knowing she was the one to save him. Mary's mind raced. The warrior's presence, his desperation, put her on edge. She had heard stories of the Apache, of their raids and battles with settlers. Yet here he was, standing before her, pleading for help. She had always prided herself on her kindness, on being able to help others, no matter their background. But this was different. This wasn't just a neighbor in need. This was a warrior, a member of a tribe that had fought against the settlers for years. But the baby. She couldn't ignore the baby. With a deep breath, Mary stepped aside, allowing the man and his child to enter. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was the desperate look in his eyes or the innocent gaze of the child. But there was something that told her she had to help, something beyond the fear of the unknown. Once inside, the man sank down onto a chair, still clutching the baby, his arms shaking from the cold. Mary quickly got to work, pouring some warm milk into a small bowl and placing it beside them. She didn't say anything at first, simply focusing on the task at hand. She was aware of the man's presence, of the way he watched her from beneath his brow, his gaze wary but grateful. He seemed unsure, as though he didn't know how to react to the kindness she was offering. The baby, still weak, managed to latch onto the milk and suckle, its tiny body trembling in the warmth of the room. Mary watched the baby for a moment, her heart swelling with compassion. She could see how fragile the child was, how much it needed care, and how far it had come. Whether from the wilderness or a tribe, she didn't know. But what she did know was that the baby needed her. As the minutes passed, the baby's cries quieted, and its small body relaxed. The man, still silent, looked at Mary with a mix of relief and something deeper. Perhaps gratitude, or maybe even guilt. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. He was a warrior, yet here he was dependent on a settler for his child's survival. Mary continued to care for the child, rocking it gently in her arms, as the warrior watched her in silence. She knew the weight of the moment. She knew that, by helping this child, she was crossing a line, one that could change everything. She also knew that the baby wasn't just the responsibility of its father anymore. Something deep inside her told her that she was meant to be a part of this child's life, that she was meant to give it a chance at survival. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for now, she would offer her care, her compassion, and her heart. The warrior, though a stranger, had come to her for help, and she would not turn him away. As the storm raged outside, the small homestead became a place of warmth and safety, a small sanctuary amid the chaos of the world. And for that moment, it didn't matter that the man was Apache, that his people had fought against settlers like her. All that mattered was the child, and the bond that was already beginning to form between Mary and this tiny, helpless soul. The man finally spoke again, his voice softer now. "Thank you," he said, his words heavy with emotion. I can't repay you." Mary looked at him, offering a small, gentle smile. "There's no need for repayment," she replied. "Just take care of your child. That's all I ask." In that quiet moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, a connection formed by the simplest of actions, helping someone in need. Days passed since the warrior, Tawin, had brought his baby to Mary's homestead. Winter was still in full force, but inside her home there was warmth, both from the crackling fire and the growing bond between her and the child. The baby, a tiny girl with soft dark eyes, had been feeding well. She had begun to fill out, her skin less pale, her cries now more full of life rather than weakness. It was clear that the milk Mary had given her, and the warmth of her care, was helping. Mary had taken to calling the baby Little Dove because of her quiet, gentle nature. The baby's fragile body had become stronger under her care, and Mary couldn't help but feel a motherly connection forming even though she hadn't expected it. Tawin, the child's father, remained mostly silent, observing from the corner of the room or sitting by the fire, his eyes heavy with worry and exhaustion. He would watch Mary as she tended to the baby, but he rarely spoke. There were moments when his tiredness seemed to overwhelm him, and he would retreat to a corner of the room to sleep, always keeping an eye on his daughter. Mary never asked him many questions about his past, about who he was, or about what had brought him to her door that night. She figured that, in time, he would offer more of his story if he wanted to. In the meantime, she focused on caring for the child. The thought of this tiny creature having no mother, no one to love her and protect her, broke Mary's heart. She couldn't let this baby suffer, not while she was able to help. Each morning, Mary would wake early, before the sun had fully risen, and begin her chores. She would make breakfast, feed the baby, and then check on Tawin. He would sometimes help with small tasks, like gathering wood for the fire, but he always seemed distant, lost in his thoughts. Mary couldn't help but notice the weariness in his eyes, the way he held his shoulders, as though carrying the weight of something much heavier than just the cold. "Will she be all right?" Tawin asked one evening, his voice rough as he watched Mary rock Little Dove to sleep. His voice was the first words he had spoken to her in several days, and it caught Mary off guard. She had grown so used to the silence that hearing him speak felt almost strange, but she understood the question. It was a question born out of fear. Fear for his child, for the future. And she understood that fear. She had felt it too many times, especially when her own children were small. "She's getting stronger every day," Mary replied softly, glancing at Tawin. "She's a fighter." Tawin didn't say anything more, but his eyes softened. He looked at little Dove, lying peacefully in her blanket, her tiny hands curled up beside her face. It was as though a weight had been lifted from his heart, if only a little. For the first time since his arrival, Tawin allowed himself to relax, even if just for a moment. He could see that Mary had a gentle heart, that she had given his child a chance to survive when no one else might have. But Mary's concern for the baby wasn't the only thing that had changed since Tawin's arrival. Her thoughts began to shift too. She had never imagined that she would be caring for the child of an Apache warrior. The stories she had heard, stories of raiding parties, of battles between the settlers and the Apache, had always painted the tribe as an enemy, as people to be feared. And yet, here she was, caring for an Apache child, with the child's father sitting quietly by the fire. At times, Mary found herself wondering if Tawin felt the same way about her. That, in a sense, she was just as foreign to him as he was to her. But over time, something changed. The walls that had once seemed so tall between them began to crumble. There were small gestures, like when Tawin would quietly gather wood or help fix a small part of the roof, things that made her realize that he wasn't here just out of obligation. He was here because he was trying too, trying to make the best of a situation that neither of them had expected. One evening, as the snowstorm outside raged against the walls of the house, Tawin finally spoke again. Mary had been sitting near the fire, humming a quiet lullaby as little Dove slept in her arms. Tawin stood in the doorway, looking out into the swirling snowflakes. "I don't want her to grow up in a world like this," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of pain. Mary looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "You want something different for her," she said gently. And he nodded, his gaze still fixed on the storm outside. "I understand," Mary added, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. She, too, wanted something better for the baby, a life of peace, of safety, things that had always seemed so out of reach for people like them. The storm outside showed no signs of stopping, and the cold winds howled against the house. But inside there was a different kind of warmth. As Mary continued to care for little Dove, and as Tawin began to open up, the bond between them began to grow. Tawin would occasionally sit by the fire, watching as Mary worked. He seemed more at ease now, his body no longer tense, though his thoughts were clearly heavy. Mary began to wonder what had brought him to her door that fateful night, what had made him choose to come to a settler's house for help. She had never asked, but she knew that in time Tawin might tell her his story, just as little Dove had shared her needs with her. One day, as Mary was gathering herbs outside, Tawin approached her. He was holding a small bundle of firewood in his arms, but his face was more open now, more expressive than before. "Thank you," he said quietly, and for the first time it didn't sound like a simple acknowledgement. It sounded like something deeper, something that spoke of gratitude for all that Mary had done. Mary smiled at him, her eyes warm. "There is no need to thank me. You and little Dove are safe here."
Tawin nodded, and for a long moment they stood together in silence, each of them knowing that something had changed between them. What started as an act of survival, an act of charity, was slowly becoming something more.
Something that neither of them could have predicted. As Mary continued to care for little Dove, she felt herself growing attached to the child. It wasn't just the act of nurturing that bound her to the baby. It was the deep, undeniable love that she felt for her. The child had become a part of her heart in a way that she couldn't explain. And in that moment, with the snow continuing to fall outside, she knew that no matter what happened, she would continue to care for little Dove for as long as she could. Tawin, too, was starting to see things differently. He had never expected this, never imagined that his daughter would be cared for by someone who had once been considered an enemy. But in the quiet of the homestead, with the fire crackling and the snow falling outside, Tawin knew that this was a new beginning, one that was far different from the life he had known before. As the days passed, The small house became more of a home than Mary had ever anticipated. Tawin, once a stranger with a heart filled with unspoken grief, had become an almost silent companion in her life. He would sit by the fire, his thoughts far away, but always near when it was time to care for little Dove. Mary could see that the man was struggling with his past, with the burden of being a warrior and a father. Yet here, in this small corner of the world, there was a peace he hadn't known in years. Little Dove, meanwhile, continued to grow stronger with every passing day. She had started to giggle softly at the sound of Mary's voice, and her once fragile body now seemed full of life, her dark eyes bright with curiosity. She was no longer the sickly baby that had been brought to Mary's door. Now she was a joy, her laughter filling the house, her tiny hands reaching out as if she already knew how much love surrounded her. Mary had taken it upon herself to teach little Dove the ways of the settlers. She would sing songs, teach her the names of things in the house, and tell her stories about the world outside, even though the child could hardly understand. But Mary believed that every word, every act of kindness, would stay with the child as she grew, shaping her into someone who could bridge the divide between the settlers and the Apache people. Tawin, too, had been watching this transformation closely. Mary had become little Dove's second mother. The bond they shared was undeniable, a quiet force that tied them together in a way that Tawin had not expected. At first he had been uncertain, unsure if this was just an act of survival or something deeper. But now, as he watched his daughter thrive under Mary's care, he began to understand that this was something far more meaningful than he had ever thought possible. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long shadows across the land, Tawin approached Mary while she was tending to the fire. Little Dove was asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling gently. Tawin, with his usual stoic expression, stood just outside the doorway looking in at the peaceful scene before him.
"Mary," he began, his voice low and cautious.
She looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something different in his eyes, an openness, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. "Mary," he repeated, taking a slow step toward her. "I don't know what to do." Mary set down the fire poker and wiped her hands on her apron. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the weight of the world that still pressed down on him. She motioned for him to sit by the fire, a quiet invitation to talk. Tawin hesitated for a moment, then sat down, his long frame taking up the space beside her. "I've lived a life full of war," he continued, his voice soft but steady.
"I fought for my people. I fought to survive."
"But now, I look at her." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the crib where little Dove lay, "and I don't know if I can give her the life she deserves." Mary listened intently, her heart understanding the depth of his pain. She had seen the same struggle in her own life, in the eyes of parents who fought to provide a better future for their children. The warrior in Tawin had been shaped by a lifetime of survival, but now he was a father, and he was learning what it meant to protect and nurture. "You want something better for her, don't you?" Mary asked quietly, her voice calm and soothing. Tawin nodded, his eyes clouded with uncertainty.
"I do. I want her to know peace, to grow up with kindness, not with the fear of war."
Mary gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Then you're already on the right path. It's not easy, I know.
But you're here, and you're trying."
That's what matters most." The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the warmth of the fire and the quiet hum of the wind outside. Tawin let out a long, heavy sigh, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. For the first time in many years, he felt the weight of his past lift, just a little. "Maybe I was wrong," Tawin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not everyone here is an enemy." Mary's heart swelled with understanding. "Not everyone," she agreed. "There's good in all of us, Tawin. You've seen that, haven't you?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with something softer than before. "I've seen it in you," he admitted. "I never expected this. I thought I would come here and take the child back. But you," he paused, searching for the right words, "you've shown me what it means to care." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Mary couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection to Tawin. She had never expected to be in this position, to be raising an Apache child alongside a warrior. Yet here she was, and here they both were. Two people who had once been strangers, now bound together by the simple act of caring for a child. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Towin and Mary sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Towin, a warrior, a father, now beginning to see the world through the eyes of someone who wanted peace. Mary, a mother, a woman who had always known kindness, now seeing the potential for a new kind of understanding between the settlers and the Apache people. In the days that followed, Towin became more involved in the daily life of the homestead. He would help Mary with the chores, cutting firewood, mending fences, and tending to the animals. He still said little, but his presence was no longer a weight to be borne. It was as though he had begun to accept that, despite his past, he could still build a future here, with Mary and little Dove. As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Towin and Mary began to talk more openly about the future. Towin had started to open up about his life before the war, about his tribe and his people. Though his stories were often filled with pain, Mary listened patiently, offering him the understanding he so desperately needed. "Do you think I can stay here?" Towin asked one evening as they sat together by the fire, the baby sleeping soundly between them. "Dude, can I raise my daughter in a world like this?" Mary looked at him, her heart full of compassion. "You've already begun, Towin. All you have to do is keep going." It was a simple answer, but it was all he needed to hear. Towin had already started to change. The warrior within him was still there, but now it was tempered by the love he had for his daughter and the kindness he had found in this small, peaceful home. As the days grew longer and the world outside began to thaw, Towin knew that he had made the right choice. He had found a place where he could lay down his weapons, at least for a while, and raise his daughter in peace, and in doing so, he had found something he had never expected, a new kind of family. As spring continued to unfold, life at Mary's homestead seemed to take on a rhythm of its own. The snow had melted, and the once frozen land now began to bloom with the soft colors of wildflowers and the fresh green of the grass. The warm sunlight bathed the house, and the air smelled of earth and new beginnings. It was a time of hope, a time when everything felt like it was starting anew. Towin had been staying with Mary and little Dove for months now, and he had become an integral part of their daily lives. No longer the distant, silent figure he had been when he first arrived, Towin had begun to speak more openly, not just with Mary, but with others in the village as well. He had learned to trust her, to believe in the kindness that she had shown him and his daughter. But deep down, he was still torn. He was caught between two worlds, the world of his past with the Apache tribe and the life he had begun to build here with Mary and little Dove. One afternoon, as Towin helped Mary repair a fence at the edge of the property, he paused, looking out over the land. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of pine and fresh soil. It was peaceful, quiet, a far cry from the life he had once known, where there had always been the threat of conflict, of raids, of battle. "Do you miss it?" Mary asked softly, sensing his moment of reflection. She had been working beside him, but she could tell that his mind was elsewhere. "Do you miss your people?" Towin didn't respond right away. He stood there, his hands resting on the wooden fence post, his gaze distant as he took in the view. He was torn between two loyalties, two parts of himself that seemed to pull him in different directions. He missed his people, his tribe, in a way that was hard to explain. They had been his family, his brothers and sisters in arms, and the land they had roamed was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. But now, here, with Mary and little Dove, he had found something else, something softer, something that he hadn't known he needed. "I miss them," Towin said quietly, his voice low, as if the words themselves were painful to say. "I miss the land, the way we lived. But I also see her." He gestured toward the house, where little Dove played in the yard, her small form visible through the window. "I see her, and I wonder if there's a place for me in that world, if I can still be a part of her future." Mary nodded, understanding more than he realized. She had always known that Towin's connection to his past was deep. It wasn't just the tribe he missed. It was the way of life, the traditions, the bond with the land and the people who had been his family for so long. But Mary had seen something else in him, something that had started to shift since the day he arrived. Tawin had started to change, slowly but surely. And now she saw the struggle in him, the desire for a different life, a life where he didn't have to choose between the past and the future. "You can find a way," Mary said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction.
"You've already made the first step by being here, by staying."
"It's not easy, I know, but there's peace here, Tawin. For you and for Little Dove."
Tawin turned to her, meeting her eyes.
There was a strength in Mary that he hadn't seen in many people, strength born not from weapons or war, but from kindness, from compassion, from the desire to help others. He had seen her care for Little Dove with a love that transcended anything he could have imagined. And he knew that, in a way, he had been given a second chance.
"I don't know if I can ever be fully accepted,"
Tawin admitted, his voice a little rough. "The world I come from doesn't forgive easily. And the settlers." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the village in the distance.
"They'll never see me as one of them. Not fully."
Mary's expression softened. She understood the weight of his words. She had seen the distrust in the eyes of some of the settlers, the wariness that came with the history between their people. It wasn't easy to bridge that divide, not when the past was filled with so much pain. "I don't know what the future holds," Mary said gently. "But I do know this. Little Dove needs both of us. She needs the love of her father. And she needs you to be the person you want to be, not the person others expect you to be." Tawin absorbed her words in silence, his mind racing with thoughts of what it would mean to stay here. Could he truly leave behind the world he had known, the world of his tribe, the world that had shaped him? Or could he make a place for himself in this new life, with Mary and Little Dove? He didn't know the answer, but the question lingered in his mind like a silent whisper in the air. The next morning Tawin woke early, before the sun had fully risen. He walked outside, the cool morning air filling his lungs as he looked out over the land. The past was heavy on his mind, but there was something else too. A sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could make peace with the life he had now, the life that had become a part of him. As he stood there watching the first rays of light touch the earth, Tawin felt a shift within himself. He realized that the world he had known, his tribe, the wars, the battles, was not the only world that existed. There was more to life than survival. There was peace. There was love. And he could have that here, with Mary, with Little Dove. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Tawin had made a decision. He would stay. He would raise his daughter in this quiet, peaceful place, away from the chaos of war and bloodshed. He didn't know if he would ever be fully accepted by the settlers, but he didn't need that. He had Mary. He had Little Dove. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a future. When he returned to the house, he found Mary sitting by the fire, her hands busy with some mending. Little Dove was napping in her crib, her small form curled up in peaceful sleep. Tawin stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the quiet scene before him. It was a life he hadn't expected, a life he hadn't thought possible. But now, it was his. "I've made my choice," Tawin said quietly, his voice firm but filled with a sense of peace. Mary looked up at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I'm staying," he added, "for her, for you." Mary smiled, a small, gentle smile that spoke volumes. "Then we'll make it work, together." And in that moment, Tawin knew that he had found something that had always seemed impossible. A family, a future, a place where he could finally lay down his burdens and be the father his daughter needed him to be. The seasons continued to change, bringing with them a sense of renewal and growth. Tawin had chosen his path. He had decided to stay with Mary and Little Dove, and every day he worked hard to build a new life with them. The house, once just a place of refuge for Little Dove, had become a home filled with love and care. The sound of Little Dove's laughter echoed through the rooms, a sound that had once been faint and weak, but now was full of life and joy. It was a constant reminder of how far they had come, how much they had all grown together. Mary watched Tawin every day, noticing the subtle changes in him. The walls he had once built around his heart had begun to come down, piece by piece. He had found a place for himself here, not just physically, but emotionally. He wasn't the same man who had arrived at her doorstep months ago, cold, guarded, and uncertain. He had become a father in the truest sense of the word, his devotion to little Dove unwavering, his bond with her stronger than anything she could have imagined. Each morning Tawin would rise early, just as he had in the past. But now, instead of setting out on a journey or preparing for battle, he would work on the homestead. He would help Mary tend to the garden, fix the roof when it needed mending, and chop firewood for the winter months ahead. Every action, no matter how small, was a step forward in creating a life that was both peaceful and fulfilling. There were still challenges, of course. Tawin knew that not everyone in the village would accept him. Some of the settlers viewed him with suspicion, still haunted by the stories of the Apache raids from years past. They were hesitant to trust him, unsure of his intentions, but Tawin never let it deter him. He had learned that action spoke louder than words. That dad, by showing up every day, by caring for his daughter, and by working alongside Mary, he was proving that he could be trusted. Slowly but surely he earned the respect of the people in the village, one small act of kindness at a time. Mary, too, had found a new sense of peace. She had always been a woman of strength, but having Tawin by her side had given her a sense of security she hadn't realized she needed. The love they shared for little Dove had brought them together, but it was the quiet moments, the ones spent side by side, working together, that had allowed them to truly bond. It was a love that had grown from the roots of mutual respect, of understanding, and of shared purpose. As the months passed, Tawin began to think more about the future. He had once feared that his past would define him forever, that he would always be seen as a warrior, a man of violence. But now, as he watched little Dove grow, he realized that he could be something different. He could be the father his daughter needed. He could build a life here, one that was full of hope, peace, and love. It was a future that he had never thought possible, but now it was his to shape. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls, Tawin turned to Mary. Little Dove was playing nearby, her small hands carefully stacking wooden blocks. Tawin's gaze softened as he watched her, his heart swelling with pride. He had come to see her not just as the child he had once carried in his arms, but as his daughter, his family. "I've been thinking," Tawin began, his voice thoughtful but steady. Mary looked up at him, waiting for him to continue. She had learned to listen to the quiet strength in his words, the way he spoke not just with his mouth, but with his heart. "I know the past can never be erased," Tawin said quietly, "but I also know that I have a choice. I have a choice to be here, to be a part of this, to be a father to her, to help raise her in a world that's different from the one I knew." Mary smiled gently, her heart full. "You've already made that choice, Tawin. Every day you show her what it means to be a father. You're doing exactly what you set out to do, creating a different life for her, a life of love and peace." Tawin nodded, his gaze never leaving little Dove, who was now giggling as she knocked down the tower of blocks she had built. It was a simple, joyful sound, but it meant everything to him. It was the sound of a future that was bright, full of possibility. Over time, Tawin's relationship with the villagers grew stronger. Some of them, once hesitant, began to see the man he had become, not just the man he had been. He was no longer the outsider. He had become a part of the community, someone who could be trusted, someone who could share in the work and the joy of building a peaceful life. And though there were still challenges, there was a sense of camaraderie that had started to take root, a shared understanding that peace was something worth fighting for, even if it meant letting go of the past. Mary, too, found herself growing more comfortable in the village. She had always been a woman of conviction, but the presence of Tawin, the way he had transformed their lives, had given her a new perspective on what it meant to truly be a family. She had always believed in kindness and helping others, but now she understood that true healing came from the courage to move forward, to embrace the unknown, and to trust that the future could be different from the past. As the years passed, little Dove grew into a bright, curious child, full of wonder and questions about the world. She learned from both Tywin and Merry, inheriting their strength and compassion. She was the bridge between two worlds, the living proof that love and understanding could overcome even the deepest divides. And as she grew, she became a symbol of hope, a symbol of what could happen when people chose peace over conflict, understanding over fear. Tywin, now a father in every sense of the word, no longer felt torn between two worlds. He had found his place. He had found his family. And every day he worked to ensure that little Dove would grow up in a world that was better than the one he had known. He had come to realize that peace was not just the absence of war, but the presence of love, the kind of love that bound them all together no matter their past. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, Tywin stood outside, looking at the horizon. Little Dove was playing nearby, her laughter filling the air. Merry joined him, standing quietly by his side. "We've come a long way," Tywin said softly, his voice filled with a deep, quiet satisfaction. Merry smiled, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Yes, we have, and we'll keep going together." And as the night sky spread out above them, filled with stars, Tywin knew that this was his home, that this was the life he had fought for, not with weapons, but with love, with trust, and with the hope that one day the world would see what they had built together, a family, a future, a life of peace.